Hi, my name is Abigail Swann, and I'm going to talk to you today about how leaf trait plasticity alters competitive ability and functioning of simulated tropical trees in response to elevated carbon dioxide. This work was led by Marlies Kovenock when she was a graduate student in my research group at the University of Washington. Our collaborators are Rosie Fisher, Charlie Koven, and Ryan Knox, and funding comes from the National Science Foundation. I'm going to start today by talking about the idea that increases in carbon dioxide can alter the traits of plants, in particular the traits of plant leaves. One example of this is in this paper from Porter et al. In 2009 in a meta-analysis analyzing responses of leaf mass per area or leaf thickness. They found that increase in carbon dioxide concentration led to thicker leaves per area in C3 plants. In turn, these changes in plant traits, traits of leaves, can alter climate. In prior work done by Marlies Kovenock and myself, we found that thicker leaves led to warmer temperatures. This is because leaves that had a higher leaf mass per area were costlier to build in terms of carbon. So plants were able to build fewer leaves. They had less leaf area. And that led to less evaporative cooling over the land surface, coupled with some cloud feedbacks, led to increases in surface temperatures, particularly over land. In addition to the direct effects of changes in plant leaf traits impacting climate, there can also be changes in the abundance of plant types. So changing of leaf traits could lead to different competitive abilities of plants, which could lead to changes in their relative abundance. And changes in who grows there could also impact climate by changing surface properties such as the albedo, the evaporative cooling, and the carbon uptake. We would like to look at this last point, this potential change in the abundance of plant types in response to a change in plant traits. And we're going to use as motivation for what those changes in traits might be a study, Lovelock et al. 1998, where they looked at 9 species of tropical trees which were grown together in open top chambers with elevated carbon dioxide concentration in Panama. And we'll use the observations from this group to motivate how the types of changes in plant traits at elevated carbon dioxide that we'd like to investigate, how this impacts plant type abundance. So I'll start by introducing the leaf response space that we'll be looking at today. On the x-axis, we have changes in leaf carbon to nitrogen ratios, and on the y-axis, leaf mass per area. At the origin here, we have our control leaf. This control leaf would have the present day properties of leaf mass per area and leaf carbon to nitrogen ratio. As we go across the x-axis and carbon to nitrogen ratios increase, plants have relatively more carbon to the amount of nitrogen. This means that their nitrogen is spread out over a wider area. And we've denoted that by this fewer number of purple dots per area that's representing the nitrogen. As we go up the y-axis, leaves get more massive per area. And if they've got the same amount of nitrogen per carbon, this means they actually have more nitrogen packed into the same area as that leaf gets thicker. And this is represented by an additional layer of thickness, which contains the same amount of nitrogen. So this is just true along these the origin of each axis. As we go up the diagonal in the middle here, leaves maintain in equal productivity per area. So they're getting thicker at the same rate that they are losing nitrogen per area. And so that nitrogen per area stays about constant. And that leaf up the diagonal, therefore, is getting thicker, which is making up for that loss of nitrogen per area. And so we can, in this leaf response space, look at this bottom triangle as a triangle in which nitrogen per area goes down. The upper triangle is one where nitrogen per area goes up, and the line up the middle is where nitrogen per area is conserved. I'm going to now overlay the observations from Lovelock et al. 1998 of those tropical trees in 9 different species of tropical trees and show you the observations of how trees responded. And what we see, we have 4 observations of how these trees responded. First, in general, leaves increase their carbon to nitrogen ratio. They are generally showing positive values along the x-axis. They are having more carbon relative to nitrogen. Second, in general, leaves are increasing in thickness. They're also mostly showing increased positive values on the y-axis. So leaves are becoming thicker as well. Observation number 3 is that this helps them maintain nitrogen per area. It compensates, but they're less productive per area than the control plant, which would occur at the origin. And observation number 4, variations in the responses could lead to different differential competitive ability. So the 9 different species responded differently relative to one another. They did not all have the same response. So we see points spread across a range of different locations. So we'd like to use these observed responses as a motivation to understand how this differential response across species might lead to differences in their competitive ability. And we're going to use a simulation model to look at that competitive advantage they might have. So we'd like to test how these leaf responses change the competitive ability of different plants. And we'll do this using the FATES dynamic vegetation model, or the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator. This is a land surface model that represents competition between plant types for resources, including light and water. We'll use this simulation at a tropical forest site in Panama, Barrow, Colorado Island, using the meteorological data observed at that location. And we're going to have 2 different control simulations, one at current CO2 levels and one at doubled CO2 levels. And then we're going to run a series of experiments where we test these different levels of trait response. So we'll sample that trait response space and we'll test how the individuals do and especially how they do in competition with other individuals that have a different trait response. So this is 92 simulations in total. So to remind everyone, we're thinking about how elevated carbon dioxide is altering plant traits and how this might alter the abundance of plant types through changing the differential competitive ability of different plants. So those 92 simulations are where we are testing all pairwise competitions between these different leaf responses. So we've sampled this leaf response space at all of the gray square locations, which includes both parts of this leaf response space where we did, Lovelock et al. In 1998 did observe that trees responded, as well as parts of this leaf response space where we are hypothetical, where we have not observed that trees have responded in that way yet. And we're going to test how each of these trees fares in competition to a tree with a different leaf response. And these simulations will look a bit like this. So in a pairwise competition, the 2 trees with different traits will compete against one another, and one of them always wins that competition eventually in the simulation. And that will represent how many times that tree with a given trait response wins the competition as percentage of its wins. So in this case, the green tree wins this competition against the brown tree. And I'm going to display this back on that leaf response space again. So this is showing you all of those simulations put together and the percentage of the time that a tree with a given trait response wins in competition with all of the other trees. So I'll walk you through what we see here. So first, as we move across the x-axis, we see that as carbon to nitrogen ratios increase, remember plants therefore have less nitrogen per area, this reduces their competitive ability. So as you move from the origin on the x-axis to the higher values on the x-axis at all levels in y, we see fewer wins. There's less winning of competitions with other plant types. So that reduces their competitive ability as they get more carbon to nitrogen. If we go up the y-axis, we can see that as leaves become more massive per area, which is helping them maintain that nitrogen per area, this enhances their competitive ability. So trees at any given carbon to nitrogen ratio, trees that have thicker leaves or higher leaf mass per area are more competitively advantageous. And this, the last point being that if you look all the way on the high values on the x-axis, you can see that there's a diminishing benefit of this increase in leaf mass per area when you get to very high carbon to nitrogen ratios. So at the very highest carbon to nitrogen ratios, the increase in leaf mass per area is less effective than it is in the more moderate changes in carbon to nitrogen ratio. So this tells us in this competition space that it's generally advantageous to have less increase in carbon to nitrogen ratio, and for any carbon to nitrogen ratio to have a more increase in leaf mass per area. But how does this affect the overall ecosystem properties? So the overall uptake of carbon by the ecosystem, or its overall flux of water. So we'll walk you through that next. So as we increase from present day CO2 values to a doubling of CO2, we see that the carbon uptake of this system increases. And this is due to higher photosynthetic rates at those higher CO2 values. But if we then look at how this is moderated by these changes in other plant traits, we see that in this part of the response space where nitrogen per area decreases in that lower triangle, that there can be as much as a 15% reduction in that carbon uptake. So observed leaf responses lead to a reduction or maybe a maintenance of carbon uptake by the system, but definitely not a gain relative to the control leaf. If we look at along that diagonal line, or where nitrogen per area is held constant, we can see that it's about neutral. So the plants that are able to maintain their nitrogen per area are doing about as well as the plants that didn't change their traits at all. And if we look at this hypothetical space where we did not observe any trees to respond, but potentially it's theoretically possible that there could be an increase in carbon uptake if plants are able to alter their leaf traits in a way that increases nitrogen per area. We'll look next at evapotranspiration. So as we go from present day CO2 to future CO2, we see that the overall evapotranspiration rate of this ecosystem decreases. And this is due to stomatal closure associated with higher CO2 values. This reduction in ET goes even farther reduction when we look at the observed leaf response space, or this reduction in nitrogen per area. We see even more reduction in evapotranspiration, as much as 7%. And again, it's about neutral in the equal nitrogen per area space. So this suggests that if we stick to the observed part of this leaf response space, we would expect less evapotranspiration than if trees did not change their traits at all. And recall back from our earlier work, this suggests that surface temperatures would increase because there'd be less evaporative cooling. If we look at that hypothetical leaf response space where plants might increase their nitrogen per area, there could be an increase in evapotranspiration because there was that large increase in carbon uptake and higher photosynthetic rates. And why does this matter? Well, a reduction in evapotranspiration can warm the surface directly and through atmospheric feedbacks. We found that in Marlies Kovenock's earlier work, as well as in this work by Marisa Legou, showing just generally across the globe the impact on temperature of a reduction in evaporative flux, or an increase in evaporative resistance. And so that, that less evapotranspiration would imply higher surface temperatures. So our take-home points here today are that leaf responses to increasing carbon dioxide alter the competitive ability of plants. In general, higher carbon to nitrogen ratios are a disadvantage, but plants might be obligated to have those higher carbon to nitrogen ratios if they're lacking nitrogen resources. However, at any given carbon nitrogen carbon to nitrogen value, we see that higher leaf mass per area or thicker leaves can improve the competitive ability. So that leaf thickness that's observed as carbon dioxide increases could be a way that plants are trying to compensate for these higher carbon to nitrogen ratios. And finally, leaves that did not respond at all, that did not alter their traits at all, were the most competitively beneficial. And so this is a really, to me, a fascinating ecological question of what is obligating the plants to alter their traits in response to carbon dioxide, and how are they compensating for that, and to give them the most competitive advantage going forward. And I'll just end by saying that this paper is posted on Earth Archive at the link below if you're interested in having a look. Thanks so much.